The Merchant of Venice, Part 3. A Pound of Flesh. In the court of justice at Venice, a great trial was to take place. Shylock the Jew claimed the forfeit of his bond. Antonio had signed the agreement that if he failed to repay the loan of 3,000 ducats by a certain date, the penalty was to be a pound of his own flesh, cut off from whatever part of his body the Jew pleased. Antonio had failed to repay the money, and Shylock insisted on the terms of the bond being carried out to the very letter. Terrible as this alternative was, there was no evading it. The Duke of Venice himself had to admit that, if Shylock chose to exact the penalty, there was no law of Venice that could prevent him. In this extremity the Duke sent for the learned Dr. Bellario at Padua to come and help them with his counsel. But when the court opened, Bellario had not yet arrived. The Duke entered and took his seat. He looked round at the assembled people. "What, is Antonio here?" "Ready, so please your grace," came back the quiet answer, and Antonio stepped forward from the place where he stood surrounded by a little band of friends. Bassanio was there, and Graciano, and many others who had come to show their sympathy with the merchant, though they could not help him in his dire extremity. The Duke spoke a few words to Antonio, saying how sorry he was to find him in the power of such a terrible adversary, to which Antonio replied with quiet dignity that since Shylock was relentless, and that no lawful means could save him, he was prepared to suffer patiently. Then Shylock was called into court, and the Duke began the trial by making an appeal to him for mercy. All the world, he said, thought that Shylock only intended to carry his apparent malice up to the hour of execution, and that then at the last moment he would show his mercy and remorse, and not only forego the forfeiture, but also forgive a portion of the loan, because of the enormous losses which had lately fallen on Antonio. "We all expect a gentle answer, Jew," concluded the Duke. Grim, stony, immovable, Shylock had listened to the Duke's appeal. The time for passionate frenzy was past. His venomed rage had settled down into a cold, calm hatred. One determination possessed him, and there was no power in the tongue of man to alter it. He would have his bond. He answered the Duke quietly, but with absolute decision. He was offered twice the amount of his loan. "If every ducat in 6,000 ducats were in 6 parts, and every part a ducat, I would not draw them. I would have my bond," was his answer to this offer. The Duke asked him how he could hope for mercy, since he rendered none. "What judgment shall I dread, doing no wrong?" was Shylock's retort. "The pound of flesh which I demand of the merchant is dearly bought. It's mine, and I will have it. I stand here for justice. Answer, shall I have it?" As far as the decrees of Venice were concerned, Shylock had the law on his side, and the Duke dared not go against them. He had power, however, to defer the trial, and he was thinking of doing this when he was told that a messenger had arrived from Padua, with letters from Bellario. The Duke bade that the messenger should be called into court, and Nerissa entered, dressed like a lawyer's clerk. The letter from Bellario stated that he was too ill to come himself, but that he had sent in his place a very wise and learned young doctor, whom he had thoroughly instructed in the case, and whose wonderful skill and judgment could be thoroughly relied on. The letter ended by saying that the Duke must not mistrust the newcomer because of his lack of years, for Bellario never knew so young a body with so old a head. It was well Bellario had given this warning, for surely no younger-looking doctor of laws had ever entered the court of justice. Portia's locks of sunny gold were hidden away beneath a doctor's cap, but nothing could conceal the youth and beauty of her face. No token of hesitation or inexperience, however, was visible in her handling of the case. She plunged in at once into the heart of the matter. Her first step was to appeal to Shylock for the score of mercy, and in words of most moving eloquence she tried to soften the Jew's hard heart, and to show him that higher even than the justice which he claimed was the quality of mercy. But Shylock stood there rigid. He might have been cut in granite for any effect that Portia's words had on him. "I crave the law, the penalty and forfeit of my bond," came the usual stubborn response. Then Portia asked if Antonio had not money to discharge the debt. "Yes," replied Bassanio, "it was there ready in the court, yea, twice the sum. If that would not suffice, he would bind himself to pay it 10 times over." If this did not satisfy the Jew, it was quite evident that he was acting through sheer malice, and Bassanio besought the learned young doctor to wrest the law just a little on this occasion, but in order to do a great right, do a little wrong. "It must not be," replied Portia. "Nothing could alter an established decree, for many an error by the same example might creep into the state. The law must be kept, the bond must be fulfilled to the very letter." "Hey, Daniel, come to judgment!" cried the triumphant Shylock. "O wise young judge, how I do honor thee!" The friends of Antonio stood silent in dismay. Even Gratiano, who had been loud in denunciation of the Jew's savage cruelty, had no words now. The bond was forfeit, Portia continued, and the Jew had the right to exact the penalty if he chose. But her winning voice still pleaded, "Be merciful. Take thrice thy money. Bid me tear the bond." "When it is paid, according to the tenor," was the grim reply. Antonio saw that all hope was over. There was no use in prolonging the discussion. "Most heartily I do beseech the court to give the judgment," he said earnestly. But even when acknowledging that the sentence must be carried out, Portia fought every inch of the way to secure some small concession for the unhappy merchant. Shylock had brought a knife into the court, to cut the pound of flesh, and scales to weigh it. But he had provided no surgeon to dress the wound afterwards. Portia begged that he would provide one, if only out of charity. Was it so nominated in the bond? No. Therefore Shylock declined. Not the smallest point would he concede. The bond should be kept to the very letter. Ah, if Shylock had only known what a pitfall he was digging for himself by insisting on this point. In a clear, firm voice, Portia began to pronounce sentence. A pound of the merchant's flesh was Shylock's. The court awarded it, and the law gave it. The flesh was to be cut off from his breast, nearest his heart, as Shylock had savagely stipulated. The law allowed it, and the court awarded it. "Most learned judge, a sentence! Come, prepare!" cried Shylock, and rattling his scales he darted forward, knife in hand, upon the merchant. But Portia's voice rang through the court. "Tarry a little! There is something else!" Shylock stood still, aghast. Antonio's friends looked up with sudden hope. It was Portia's turn now to keep to the letter of the law. The bond gave no mention of the word blood. The words expressly were a pound of flesh. Let Shylock then take his bond, his pound of flesh. But if in the cutting he shed one drop of Christian blood, his lands and goods were by the laws of Venice confiscated to the state of Venice. "Is that the law?" gasped Shylock, and Portia answered that he should see the act for himself. As he had urged justice, let him be assured he should have justice, more than he desired. "Oh, learned judge!" cried Gratiano, mocking Shylock's former words of praise. "Mark, a Jew, a learned judge!" "Pay the bond thrice, and let the Christian go," said Shylock. "Here is the money," said Bassanio eagerly, but Portia held up his hand. Soft! The Jew shall have all justice. Soft, no haste. We shall have nothing but the penalty. Shylock was to cut off his pound of flesh, but he was to shed no blood, nor was he to cut more or less than just 1 pound. If he cut more or less than a just pound, if the scale turns, even by the weight of a hair, thou diest, and all thy goods are confiscate, pronounced Portia. Give me my principal, and let me go, said Shylock. I have it ready for thee. Here it is, said Bassanio, again holding out the bags of gold, and again Portia stayed him. He has refused it in the open court. He shall have merely justice and his bond. Shall I not have barely my principal? Demanded the cowed Shylock. Thou shalt have nothing but the forfeiture, to be so taken at thy peril, Jew. Why, then the devil give him good of it. I'll stay no further question, cried Shylock, turning to leave the court in a fury of baffled rage and spite. But he was not to get off so easily. The law had still another hold on him. He, being an alien, had offended against the laws of Venice by seeking the life of a citizen. The penalty for this, that half his goods went to the citizens, the other half to the coffers of the state, and the offender's life lay at the mercy of the Duke. Stunned and crushed by this sudden calamitous turn of affairs, Shylock listened. All through the trial he had claimed nothing but justice. He had insisted that the very letter of the law should be fulfilled. The measure he had meted out to Antonio was now to be measured out for himself. But the Duke of Venice was merciful enough to pardon Shylock's life before he asked it. As for his wealth, half of it would go to Antonio, the other half to the state, but humbleness might remit the latter into a fine. Nay, take my life and all, pardon not that, said Shylock, half dazed. You take my house when you take the prop that sustains it. You take my life when you take the means whereby I live. Antonio said he would resign half the money due to him, provided Shylock would let him keep the other half in use, to render it at Shylock's death to the husband of his daughter Jessica. Further, for this favor Shylock was to do 2 things. He was to give up his Jewish religion, and he was to make a will leaving all his possessions to Lorenzo and his daughter. He shall do this, said the Duke, or else I will recant the pardon which I lately granted. Art thou contented, Jew? What dost thou say? asked Portia. And what was left for Shylock to answer? Baffled of his revenge, stripped of his wealth, forced to disown his faith, his very life forfeited, a hated, despised, miserable old man, he stood alone amidst the hostile throng. Not one face looked at him kindly, not one voice was raised in his behalf. Twice he strove to speak, and twice he failed. Then, in a hoarse whisper through parched lips, came the faltering words, I am content.